Thank you, Nick, and thank you most of all for putting this on and giving us such a good overview, such an impressive panorama of how climate change policy, climate change activism, and climate change thinking is developing in the United States. And I must say, I agree with almost everything that's been said. And when you went through the different items, the different topics, I kept ticking boxes. And in a way, I would say we have a lot of what you've been talking about in Europe too, and have had it maybe for some years. Yet still the impression is presently that somehow Europe has lost steam, maybe, with regard to climate change and how we address that. And I would like to describe, first of all, where we might stand, and then how that impression comes about and whether it's merited or not, or where it might be merited. So I would like to start by mentioning, for instance, that in the still relevant European security strategy that was first drafted in 2003, climate change at the time was already identified as one of the major challenges to European security. May have been forgotten, but at the time, I think Europe probably was the first entity to go to that point. And I recall that the British government at the time said that climate change was the greatest single challenge to British security. The European Union, in the still sort of guiding economic development strategy, the so-called EU 2020 strategy, clearly identifies climate change issues and issues related to climate change as one of three headline goals. The strategy has been summed up by saying we should develop a smart, inclusive, and sustainable economy. And sustainable alludes to mostly to climate change. And it broke down this headline goal of sustainability into sort of sectoral goals. And if you look at the midterm financial planning of the European Union, for instance, it does state that at a minimum, more than 20% of all the programs that we implement as a European Union have to address adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So I think this is some really relevant facts. And then you go into the different sectors and you will find a sweeping policy of what we call climate change mainstreaming. There have been policies, explicit policies for green infrastructure, 2013, forestry strategy, 2013, maritime planning, common agricultural policy. 19 of 28 member states have their own adaptation strategies. There is a covenant of 100 mayors from around Europe who have assembled under the headline Mayors Adapt in 2014. The EU had its first adaptation green book in 2007, the white book 2009, the strategy for adaptation 2013. So if you look at this from an institutional point of view, it seems as if we covered almost everything. And well, there are some obvious shortcomings. If you go to the detail, if you, for instance, look at how member states have dealt with the Water Framework Directive, only 1/3 of the member states have included flooding risks deriving from climate change into their own planning. So obviously there are some soft points, some weak points. But from an institutional point of view, it could look good. And if you look at the raw figures of energy policy goals, for instance, minus 40% is not exactly what the European Parliament would have wanted, and it's not what Nick would like to see or what I would like to see, but it's still much more ambitious than anything you can find either in the United States or China or any other international actor. So why is it then that still there is this impression that somehow Europe is losing steam? I think because we do. And I would try to explain maybe 3 or 4 reasons for that weakening of the European determination. First of all, I think it's been underrated how much the failure of COP16 in Copenhagen, so that disillusioned people, activists. Somehow everybody had been investing so much hope in that one decisive diplomatic event that when it went down the drain, it deflated hope so fast you couldn't even see how it went away. Before Copenhagen, you couldn't find a single major diplomatic event where climate change was not on the agenda. After Copenhagen, it completely disappeared. So, I mean, all the activists that had been investing found themselves kind of, or that was at least the perception, found themselves cornered, isolated, somehow failed. I think that had a major impact. Second, cap and trade, which more than 10 years ago the Europeans dared to sort of put on the table, failed. I mean, we still hold on to it, but obviously with a pricing level clearly below 10 euro per ton of CO2, it's not giving the innovation-oriented signals. It's not creating a business environment where those who would invest into efficiency technologies, for instance, would benefit of the pricing of CO2 as much as we all hoped. When the system was first introduced, everybody expected the price to be in a range of above 30 euro per ton. Now we're maybe at 20% of that. So clearly that's, I mean, Europe in a way is paying a price for being a leader. If you are a leader, you always find yourselves making mistakes that others can then learn from. And of course, if you make the mistakes, sometimes you insist on your mistakes. And sometimes you find it harder to learn from what you're doing wrong than others who take a fresh view. So I think this is also what happened. And third, I think the crisis has played a major role. The fact that Europe has been beset with economic problems and that this gave a lot of additional leverage to those voices from the industry that didn't want to adopt the agenda anyhow. 5 years ago, I would say the balance in industrial and business circles was pretty well pro-change. Today, it's worse. There's been a rollback. There's been, again, an attitude addressing climate change not as part of the solution, but part of the, or climate change policy not as part of the solution, but as part of the problem. And I'm not by no means saying this is sort of a consolidated view. There are a lot of progressive companies like Unilever from the Netherlands or many others that I could name that are advocating actively for more ambitious policies because they have learned that this is their present and their future business case, but it's not as homogeneous as it would have been 5 years ago. So that's also a reason. And fourth argument, I would say that Europe made a major mistake on the diplomatic front by insisting on what I would call a legalistic approach towards international climate diplomacy. I mean, Europe's always insisted on an internationally binding agreement, which has never been forthcoming. Even before Copenhagen, it was quite obvious that there wouldn't be 67 votes in the Senate ever to ratify such an agreement, a binding agreement, nor would there be a majority in the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. So obviously that was never going to happen. Still, Europe insisted to a degree on that binding nature of an agreement that it ignored the more pragmatic approaches that more recently the US and China have agreed upon. And I think it's been one of the sensational achievements of this present Obama administration that President Obama and the guys who did it for him, people like John Podesta, managed to get this G2 agreement with the Chinese. I think that has created a lot of new dynamic, even though the ambition is well below where both countries should be. The Chinese ambition is not at all ambitious. It's quite obvious that China could peak easily 5 years earlier than they're promising to do. But the very fact that for the first time they pledge to take a responsibility, that's a great game changer. And also I think the goal that the United States expressed has added new dynamic to the international diplomatic game. And Europe has been too reluctant to take a similar pragmatic approach and too reluctant to come up with a good enough offer as regards climate finance to the developing world to really remain an international leader. So these are what I would describe as 4 weak points. But having said all that, I would still say there's a lot going on in Europe, and I will just shortly list a few things. France has just issued legislation forcing companies to publicize their carbon footprint. Germany is pushing hard for the renewables policy. The Bank of England and the ECB have started to look energetically into the carbon bubble issue, and the carbon divestment movement is catching on fast. Norway is moving away from, starting to move away from fossils. A major French insurance company like AXA has said that they will move away from fossil fuels. And also the European Union is finding some new tracks. Because of the Russian problems that we're facing with Ukraine, there is more willingness today to have a united European energy policy than there's ever been. We used to advocate a common energy market, but we never really had it. Now, for the first time, there is an ambition to have an energy union, and there might even be a chance, and it's because of conventional sort of security risks that all of a sudden it helps transforming European energy policies towards more commonality. And I think that will help transforming European policies also with regard to climate change. So I think there's a lot of change. And the one thing that I think we cannot overestimate is the announcement of the new encyclical. And I think this is really also something very new, and I think there will be a completely new dynamic up to Paris and after Paris. It's for the first time that not just the scientific elite is pushing the climate change agenda. It's also now becoming the religious leaders. It's becoming the government leaders. If you look at G7, it's becoming increasing parts of the business community. So I think there's an incipient transformation, and Europe is well part of that. So I'm not at all pessimistic.
We always like Reinhard